3, hit it!
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's Caffeine for the Soul. And if you're new to these podcasts, or if you want to go deeper into the philosophical understanding at the heart of the inside-out understanding that I talk about in these podcasts, please visit michaelneill.org/basic course to sign up for our free basic course in this understanding. I used to start my client sessions with a variation on a question. And the question was some form of, would you be okay if a miracle happened during our time together today? And that question had come to me as a variation of what's called the miracle question from brief therapy. And the miracle question is, if a miracle happened tonight when you slept and dreamt, and you woke up in the morning and the miracle had happened, how would you know that the miracle had happened? And how would I, as the sort of therapist or guide or coach, how would I know that the miracle had happened? And it was sort of a way of getting people really to consider a possibility that seemed too ridiculous to consider. So mine was a variation of that. It was just, hey, would you be open to a miracle happening during our time together today? And almost everyone would say no. I mean, every now and again somebody would say yes, but the common answer was no. No, I just want to get better at this. I just want this to be less of a problem. It was almost too daunting, the idea that a miracle could happen, that things could happen beyond my idea of how hard it must be to change big problems, to change things that seem indelible and an intrinsic part of life, or at least of my life. But when I first came across the inside-out understanding, when I first started studying the 3 principles that I talk about in these podcasts, what drew me to it was I kept finding that my problems were going poof. Like I'd bring a really big problem to a session, and by the end of the session, it wasn't that I knew what to do about it. It was that I sometimes couldn't even find the problem anymore. It was like I got amnesia for the problem. And it wasn't bad amnesia where then, the problem was still there, but I just forgot about it and there it's rare. It just was gone. And I noticed that the more I looked to the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness, the nature of thought, our true nature as human beings, the more my problems would dissolve instead of be solved. Instead of me having to figure out what to do and doing it, the thing that had seemed so problematic just kind of went poof, and it just wasn't a problem anymore. And I started noticing that was happening with my clients. And you'd think this is great, but for me, it was troubling. Because I was like, well, wait a minute, I thought these were real problems. And I kind of would give myself grief that obviously I'd been making a big deal out of nothing, because if it could just go that quickly. And I realized I wasn't alone in that when I was talking to one of my mentors at the time, George Pransky. And he shared a story of working with an executive who was having the same experience of some of the biggest problems that he was coming. He just going poof. And he would come to George and he would go, George, how is this possible? I've been wrestling with this in my company for 5 years. I've been wrestling with this in my family for 20 years. This is something that my father wrestled with and his father wrestled with, and I've been wrestling with, and now it's just gone. Are you telling me that my problems aren't real? They're just a mirage? And George thought for a second and said, well, they're a real mirage. In other words, it really looks real until you start to see for yourself that what makes a fact into a problem is thought, is the idea that it shouldn't be how it is, that it should be other than how it is. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do things to try to change it anyways. It just means that making it into a problem is not necessarily the best way to change it. Now, I would have said, I know all this. But then a couple of months back, I was talking with a friend who was very excited about a new insight that she'd had, and she was sharing that she'd seen something really new about her childhood and how she'd been interpreting things and kind of telling the story of her childhood in a way that made it seem permanent and pervasive and like she would never be able to get over it. And she saw, I'm making that up. I'm making that bit up. Not what happened, but the implications of what happened and how it would play out for the rest of her life. And she said, with so much excitement and hope in her voice, I wonder if it's just going to disappear. And I came in, the expert, the podcast guy, the coach, and the author, and I said, well, it's a habit. So, logically, probably the thought will keep coming up. Now, you might be less bothered by it. You might see it more for what it is. It will become less and less problematic over time. And I could feel, even as I was saying it, and even though everything I was saying was very logical and reasonable and now don't get your hopes up so that you won't be disappointed later, I could feel all the excitement and enthusiasm and hope getting sucked out of the conversation. And I realized to my horror, I'd forgotten that things can just go poof. I'd forgotten that when something is made of something as ephemeral as thought, it can disappear in a heartbeat. No matter how scary the thought, it doesn't take any longer to change than a happy thought. No matter how often you've thought something, it doesn't take any longer for a new thought to come along than if you're thinking about lunch and then you're thinking about what you're going to do this afternoon. In A Course in Miracles, they say there's no order of difficulty in miracles because the miracle is just a shift in perception. It's a shift in seeing. It's a shift in thought. And it takes no effort and no time for thought to change. Thought is a formless energy that brings form to our lives. And I got excited again about remembering that things can just go poof. So when you think about what it seems like you're up against in your life, when you think about what seem like your most solid and intractable problems, I want to invite you this week to just play with the idea. Just be open to consider, what if even that could just go poof? And you could wake up tomorrow morning and it just wouldn't look like a problem anymore. And that doesn't mean you can't do things to try to change the circumstances. It just means it no longer weighs on you. It no longer blocks you. It no longer limits you. And in some cases, you can't even remember what it was. Now, if that sounds a little bit nuts and a little bit crazy, I'm going to double down and say it's even more worth your playing with this little thought experiment. Have fun, learn heaps, happy exploring, and I'll talk with you soon.